Okay. Hello and welcome to Colonial Outcast. I'm Mark. We are the podcast that Queen Elizabeth was warning her butler about in the last days of her death. Um, and we are here to disappoint that entire empire as well. Today we are going to talk about revolution. This has been an episode that I have been excited to do for a while now, ever since we had Butch on. I believe it was a month ago or so.
Yeah, sounds about right.
Um, yeah, a month ago, Butch touched on a lot of things that I feel like have been left out of the conversation in regards to world events. What we're seeing happening in Gaza with the Palestinians and in our society in general. And so this episode is going to be the first installment of a multi-part series on revolution. And it's designed to create somewhat of a toolkit for all of us in going forward and how we can foster this revolution in a very healthy manner. I can think of nobody better to start this off than Butch. Butch is a professor of history. In my opinion, I think he has the healthiest view that I have seen on revolution, and we're going to talk about that. But let me just read this really shallow intro that I wrote to the best of my abilities to try and be as with a little bit more with the same amount of flair, maybe a little less than Greg Stoker. So, with the ongoing genocide in Gaza and the subsequent tensions in the Middle East as a whole between Iran, Israel, and Israel's sugar daddy, the United States, the specter of World War III is looming in every household that follows the news. Russia is now mobilizing arms and equipment to Tehran. Israel is becoming increasingly unstable in its provocations, not only through its unfettered bloodlust against the Palestinians, but also through its petty jabs against other nations through assassination. So the question on many people's minds right now is, are we entering World War III? What's funny, a few years ago, I would have been saying yes. And that childhood fascination with my GI Joes and war in general I'd be extremely excited and interested about all of this military posturing. But I don't know. I guess as I get older, I'm getting more mature and I'm starting to gear more towards humanity. So I am going to propose the theory that we are not entering World War III, because you can't have World War III if you have a worldwide revolution. It's hard to get citizens. It's hard for a government to get citizens to fight the citizens of another nation if all the citizens are rising up against their governments. You can't have a world war. And that's why I believe that the tensions that we're seeing in the Middle East, this is the conspiracy theorist coming out in me. I believe all of this is a desperate attempt by the elites to prevent a worldwide revolution. They would rather have us fighting each other instead of us fighting them. And now the question on revolution is, okay, if we are in a revolution, how do we guide this ship in the best direction? We've had revolutions in the past in the history. Some have been successful, some were not. Some were successful with a touch of genocide and a touch of massacre. So we have to guide this ship in the best way possible. And I one of the things that is very unique about this particular social revolution we're seeing as a result of this passion for the Palestinians and us standing up for the Palestinians is that it's happening very organically. It's not being led by any one organization or any one leader, which is great because there's no head of a snake to cut off. So to help us untangle the history of this and look at all of this from a historical context, we're bringing in Butch. And what caught my ear in our last interview with Butch was he brought up a very important element when it comes to the United States, a revolution in the United States in particular. And this goes along my way of thinking. You cannot talk about revolution in the United States without talking about the Black Panthers. And you cannot talk about the Black Panthers without talking about Bobby Seale. And you can't talk about Bobby Seale without talking about Islam. And you can't talk about Islam without talking about the subversion and the Western Empire's demonization of Islam.
Yeah.
You simply cannot separate revolution and Islam in this world. And that's not a religious statement. That's just statistics. Islam represents 2 billion people on this planet. I and I'm trying to remove my bias towards Islam, because I do have a particular bias towards Islam. As a Christian,
Mm-hmm.
Islam had a huge impact on my life when I went to Palestine as a Zionist, as a pro-Israel Zionist. Islam, it it changed my view of the world, and it made me a better Christian. So that's that religious part I'm putting aside right now. But so I just want to make that very clear that I do have a bias towards Islam, but also I have a very pragmatic view of Islam as well. I do think that it's also Islam is the simply the logistical part of Islam. The fact that the West has been demonizing Islam plays a part in all this discussion around revolution. So, Butch, sorry about that long intro that was all over the place. I want to start. I want to go back in time a little bit. If we can just talk about the 1960s for a second, because we can't talk about revolution in the United States without talking about 1960s. Yeah. Can we talk about the Black Panthers and what made them so unique as opposed to a lot of other movements that happened at that time?
So we started this conversation, the last time we were together, and it's good to be, back with you.
Yes, sir.
And I'll connect it actually with the piece that's on Islam as well, because a lot of the foundational generation of organizers in the Black Panther Party were explicit about the way that Malcolm X, later El Haj Malik Shabazz, affected their thinking. That kind of spiritually rooted Black Muslim militancy was something that was very inspirational for the Panthers, even if they did not end up subscribing to Islam as a system of religious meaning. They were drawing heavily on a Black Muslim resistance tradition as embodied in Malcolm. You asked about the Panthers, and I'll focus in on the Panthers specifically, but I would be remiss not to also mention that Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, another one of these great revolutionary organizers, thinkers, starts out with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, and eventually, becomes, kind of prominent movement leader in a number of spaces, also explicitly credits Malcolm and Malcolm's resistance thinking for a lot of his own inspiration. So if we're going to go back to the 60s, Malcolm is this crucial figure because he's bringing together this Black resistance tradition, revolutionary tradition, and it's framed through an Islamic lens because of his own experience. Now, with respect to the Panthers, we had this conversation, we began this conversation before. What was so dangerous about the Panthers and also dangerous about Malcolm was that they threatened to bring Black resistance movements outside of the identity fold of the Black community. Bobby Seale, Huey Newton, and Panther leadership, Fred Hampton, another one, were getting incredibly good at taking their message to white working class audiences, to Latin audiences. You had brown Panthers, you had white Panthers, you had Panthers popping up on international venues. You had Maori Panthers, right? Black Panthers in New Zealand. This was a resistance movement that was breaking out of the community which birthed it, which is really crucial part of the story, right? Black freedom struggles have consistently, time and time again, led the way towards revolutionary breakthroughs in the history of America, because Blackness itself was forged as a way of resisting white supremacy as a form of domination, right? You got African descended people speaking literally hundreds of different languages that come together and form a community, form a communal identity. And this had never happened with this enslaved community in any other part of the world, right? The slaves of the Romans and the Greeks don't become one people and start to think of themselves in opposition to the ruling class, but Blackness itself emerges as a resistance to white supremacy. So therefore, you see this community, which had an orientation towards resistance for white supremacy, now pioneering tools that allowed us to talk about freedom on a broader scale. And this had happened, by the way, in the 1830s, right? When Frederick Douglass and then people like John Brown are starting to think along similar kind of lines. And this is what the white supremacist power structure in the United States of America has always feared most. They've always feared that people would be able to pierce the identity politics of white supremacy and be able to align themselves along essentially like class lines to take down the ruling class and the elite power structures. So as soon as the Panthers were demonstrating themselves as a real threat to do precisely this, they became the most dangerous organization, right? As soon as Malcolm is, going back to things that Paul Robeson did in the 1940s that got him blacklisted, which is going to international bodies of law to get the United States condemned on human rights violations, then that's when Malcolm gets taken out. And the reason is very, very simple, is that both internationally and domestically, you have a Black resistance movement that is bursting outside of the identity ghetto that is used to control American populations, thinking exclusively along racialized lines. And these are people that are still very Black, right? It's not a negation of Black identity. It's just a realization that true liberation in a Black resistance movement, in a working class resistance movement, has to think beyond race, because race in and of itself is not a real thing. It is a construct that was made to get people to behave in a certain way. African culture, very much a real thing, right? Indigenous culture, very much a real thing. Race, not a real thing. So when you start to see people like Malcolm and people like the Panthers bringing in an international dimension and a dimension that shatters the racial bounds that America is constantly trying to impose on people, that's when they become public enemy number one. That's when they become the most dangerous people on the planet. That's when COINTELPRO goes in. That's when CIA assassins go in, when police forces, get recruited to either murder, militants or to look the other way while paid assassins murder militants.
Yes, and I want to get into that particular part of it a little later, because that's very important about the subversion and infiltration and sabotage. But before I do that, another thing that I feel like was so dangerous about the Black Panthers, I've been obsessed with the Black Panthers since I kind of learned about
Me too. So we have that in common.
Yeah. And they are totally underrated, and they were demonized. At least I remember as a kid when you heard at least in kind of like, I grew up in white evangelical culture. So you would hear about Black Panthers were like this was how reductive they were. They were like the Black KKK, which is totally not true. But but believe it or not, that was how they were framed for so many years in white culture, because it's, again, like you said, getting white people to fear Black liberation, because it's kind of like, that saying, every accusation is a confession, right?
Yep.
White people were afraid of that because they thought that maybe Black people would do to them what they did to Black people, which is totally, that theory didn't hold up. So beyond the demonization of the Black Panthers, one of the dangerous things about them is that logistically and the way that they formed their structure, they were bringing about some very revolutionary tactics, such as providing food for their own, being self-sufficient. So I think that the combination of them reaching out to other cultures and bringing them in, and being in their universality that they were starting to expand into, as well as the fact that they were strategically and tactically getting very good. Because I believe a lot of the Black Panthers were former military. So they were bringing in their military experience to give power to average citizens against the government. And the last thing the government wants is self-sufficient citizens, so that they don't have to depend on them.
Yeah, they want to cultivate a kind of, eternal dependency. I mean, just two simple kind of well-documented, Panther programs that are illustrative of the point that you're making. So when I was a kid, growing up in serious poverty in Washington D.C., we had free breakfast programs. We know with the schools. The reason why we have free breakfast programs, which have now finally been phased out. The reason why we had those as state and federal programs was because the Panthers had initiated hot breakfast programs in Oakland, where they served free food to the community for kids before school, because they know that they're dealing with working class households. Oftentimes, kids are going to school without having eaten anything, and then their academic achievements are being compromised, by the call of their bellies. So they literally just started a breakfast program. Eventually, municipal authorities, state authorities, and federal authorities had to compete with this, because this is an effective program. And it was an opportunity for the Panthers to demonstrate that they weren't just about like political education and indoctrination, but about service to the community,
Yes.
providing real service to the community. Second thing, to the kind of militant point, and there's an amazing group of brothers and sisters in San Diego called Pillars of the Community. I'll shout out Khaled Alexander now, because they continue this part of the legacy of the Panthers. Is that what Pillars does is that they literally just follow police cars around. Right?
Wow.
Yeah, they just follow.
It's like a citizen's watch. It's like a citizen's monitor.
Citizens watch on the police, right? And that was I think that was probably the thing that was most threatening, in the proper sense of the word, threatening, to white people and white power structures, was that the Panthers, took advantage of the fact that the Second Amendment, guarantees the right to bear arms. Never mind that the fact that it's supposed to be in a well-organized militia, and that's never the case. And that well-organized militia is the reason why you have a Second Amendment, is that you wanted armed white citizens to patrol the enslaved population. That's why we have a Second Amendment. But the Panthers were like, hey, we've got a Second Amendment. We've got the right to carry guns too. We've got the right to open carry. So they would literally, with weapons in plain view, follow police. And so that makes it impossible for police to like sexually abuse women during arrests, for them to murder unarmed people. And this is in a time before cell phone cameras. Black folks are getting gunned down by the cops, choked out by cops all the time. And the police report always says the same thing that it said in George Floyd case, right? Died of a fentanyl overdose, died of a drug overdose, fell out of a chair, like Stephen Biko in South Africa. They said that he fell out of a chair. He had 17 blunt force trauma wounds to the back of his head. So apparently he fell out of a chair 17 times. So the point is that the Panthers were fighting against this. They were keeping eyes on the police, and they were armed. So just these two, simple programs are illustrative of the kind of power that they had. The power of the carrot and the power of the stick, the way to provide an incentive to the society to realize that there are communal ways of organizing to take care of one another's needs and to take care of one another's security that are not dependent on this police state that utilizes violence to oppress and abuse you. And if we can just kind of just think through your framing questions about revolution, this is the biggest space where our community is currently lacking. We are not being as aggressive as we might otherwise be in framing those alternative institutions of communal care and extending those on a broad scale. There are all kinds of different organizations. There's all kinds of different communal spaces that are doing those in separate and isolated environments. And that's good for the reason that you mentioned before. It means that it's very, very hard to just cut off the head of the snake. At the same time, it also means that many of us actually do not perceive how close we are to success, because these organizations are not actually threaded together and don't have those kinds of powers of the multiplying effect, essentially, of like working in common cause, shoulder to shoulder, in sync on particular activities. So Kwame Ture, who I mentioned before, talked about this as the fundamental struggle I think that he saw himself facing in the latter years of his life, was that he drew this distinction between mobilizing and organizing. He said people mobilize around issues, but revolutionaries organize against systems. And Malcolm had said something similar. Malcolm had said that we are not outnumbered. We vastly outnumber them. We are
Yes.
out organized, right?
Yes.
Capitalist extraction is a very organized form of violence, and we need more organized forms of organic resistance. They do not have
Yes.
to be hierarchical in the way that those systems are, but they do have to connect people laterally so that we can be standing shoulder to shoulder when the storms that are going to come through this revolutionary process hit us. We're going to need to be standing shoulder to shoulder in order to stay upright. And then most importantly, is that as we're starting to piece together a society in the aftermath of this, we are really going to need to have bonds of solidarity, affection, trust, and love between different communal spaces in order
Yes.
for that process to bear fruit. The last thing that I'll say on this is that you saw an excellent example of how this works in Bangladesh recently, right? And this
I was
is
about to say that. It's ironic that we're having this episode today, right after we're seeing technically the first one to do it.
yep.
They in the recent memory.
Well, and this is the thing that, and you saw a similar process, happening during the so-called Arab Spring before US imperialism co-opted that process and hand selected the dictators that would replace the fallen dictators. And what happened in Bangladesh is really instructive, right? Student protest movements where the students simply refuse to leave the streets end up toppling a regime in its entirety. And this is precisely why the threat of that is precisely why the liberal, the neoliberal corporate Democrats responded with outright thuggery to campus protests all through the spring. Incredible levels of reactionary police violence, and of course police sitting on the sideline while actual Zionist versions of the KKK, right? The modern day Irgun is beating up kids on UCLA campus, and the cops are nowhere to be found, but then the cops are cracking heads. Well, the reason for that is simple, and I really, really hope that especially the young generation here in the United States of America takes notes from this. There is no government anywhere on the face of the earth that is prepared logistically to put down a mass uprising of its youth.
Yes.
They do not have enough police. They do not have enough coverage. And that's why they came so hard and in such draconian fashion, because they know that if that wildfire starts to spread, they're finished. They just can't do it. They don't have the logistical capacity. And I was discussing this with my wife this morning, is that what it means, if we really reflect on this fact, is that right now we are actually the only thing between us and successful revolution. We're too comfortable. We are too complacent. We are not willing to actually become ungovernable. And I'll stop there. There's things that I would add about Kamala and her role in this in a minute, but please go ahead.
Oh, we're gonna get there. I know you're you can't. I know you can't wait to talk about her and just sing her praises, bro. Yeah, Kamala. Well, I want to rewind back a little bit. You were talking about networking together laterally.
Yes.
See, here's the paradox. This is, in my opinion, this is the biggest challenge we got. And I don't think anybody's really figured it out yet, simply because of the ever-evolving nature of this cat and mouse game between government's oppression and us adapting and evolving. It's a constant cat and mouse evolution. We start to come up with new tactics. They discover it. They come up with new tactics. We find an antidote to those tactics. The biggest problem with organizing is that when you organize, now you're a target.
Yep.
Now you have a structure, and guess what? That's where the CIA comes in. Oh, you guys have a leader? We're gonna compromise him, whether it be bribery, threats, or just assassination, sabotage, or smearing in the news media. But you need to organize to be successful, right? You need to create an infrastructure so that as the revolution is happening, we can all still live. We can all still buy food, collaborate with each other, have resources to get whatever we need done without the government shutting off a single point of failure.
Well, this is the real radical potential of the encampments, right? I mean, I don't know if you got the chance to visit many. I only visited the one that we had here at the UCSB campus. But one of the things that was immediately apparent. So you've got Jewish anti-Zionists. You've got what would be thought of as like conservative practicing Muslims. You've got anarchists, you've got socialists.
Right,
you've got anarchists, you've got socialists, you've got black freedom struggle, young veterans, and you've got communal care. I mean, like the Muslims are doing like dhikr, sessions, chanting sessions. They're doing healing, stuff. People are doing drumming. It's literally a potluck of our communal material and spiritual resources. People are arranging to have food, delivered to these. When we are actually put in the position where we need to be responsible for self-care, we are capable of not only transcending these superficial differences, but actually like celebrating and embracing them, like loving them, right? Enjoying being in that space and benefiting from one another, which, to bring it back to Islam briefly, right? God says in the Quran, everything in the variations of your tongues and colors, God made you that way so that you would know one another. And one of my favorite it's beautiful. And one of my favorite West African scholars, he says that the implied meaning of the verb to know in that verse is to love. You were made in different tongues and colors so that you would love one another, so that you would appreciate the diversity of your tongues and colors, the diversity of your cultures, the diversity of your approaches. That actually was happening in a very organic way amongst a bunch of 18 to 30-year-olds on university campuses. And it was not hierarchical. It wasn't something that was planned from the top. Oftentimes, even the orgs that were sort of most vocally at the front of those movements, like Students for Justice in Palestine or Jewish Voice for Peace, campusing, were not in control of those encampments, and we're not the ones that were setting the agenda. This was a communally set agenda, and I think that that's also part of why the repression was so severe, is that those kinds of it's a technical academic term that's going to be troublesome, hierarchical, right? That rather than hierarchically organized, they're hierarchical. They're organized around bringing together people of diverse backgrounds in egalitarian structures of communal leadership. That's what hierarchy is. And there's lots of examples for this in the African tradition of, societies with millions of people in the market economies, no hierarchical state, hierarchical bonds of solidarity that allowed the society. That allowed the society.
So what time period was this?
This is quite literally running right down into the period of European colonization in the 19th century. You still had living examples of these, kind of West African forms of social organization that were still extant. So all of this is just, and not to mention that you had structures like this throughout the indigenous Americas. I mean, people learn about the hierarchical, imperial states of the Aztecs and the Incas, but they don't learn, we don't learn even the basics, right, about something like the Iroquois Federation, which, right? All
right. Yeah. See, this is why I love you, bro. I'm telling you, man, I have not met anybody in my life that has been eloquently outlining all of this. And it's right down my line of thinking when it comes to social structure. Like, and I'm going to offer a grievance I have about the discussions about political ideology. We talk about capitalism. I think all of us are aware that capitalism has been a huge pipe dream that was fed to us, and it turned out to be a lie, right? But so people, they argue communism versus socialism. Should we have communism? So should we have a socialist government? Should we have a a quasi-capitalist socialist system. And what annoys me about these conversations is that my problem with all of these political ideologies and what they all have in common is that we're still talking about government, political ideologies, and theories of government that were invented by old white dudes in Europe.
Yep.
Instead of talking about what I just think it's time we give the indigenous forms of government and political ideologies a little chance, instead of constantly putting in front and center these political ideologies that were theorized in Russia or Europe. Let's give indigenous theory on government structure and societal structure a chance, for goddamn sake, like. And so you brought up Africa, and you brought up the Iroquois Confederation,
yep.
Which is, by the way, the reason why I am I love the Constitution is not because it was invented by the founding fathers. It wasn't. It wasn't invented a few hundred years ago. The Constitution was conceived
of. It's a riff on the Iroquois Federation.
It's 10,000 years old.
Yeah.
The Constitution is actually 10,000 years old, and it comes from the Iroquois. I actually bought a copy, and we don't talk about that because we always want to keep the focus on European invented forms of government.
Yes.
And that's been my biggest problem with this. And you're the first person to ever start that I've personally heard of that's talked about indigenous forms of social structure that we never give light of day to.
So a couple of things on this. The first, like a theoretical and intellectual point about this, and then some of the practical implications. The theoretical and intellectual point is something in my first book, which is a history of Islamic education and society in West Africa that runs over 1,000 years. The thing that was most critiqued about it, but then also most celebrated about it, was that I did not depend on any European social theorists of any kind to develop the analytical apparatus in the book. I used the philosophy of knowledge that was inherent in African Islamic society to explain itself, right? I used it as the analytical framework through which I wrote this history. And for me, that was a profoundly subversive move, but also a really, really, what's the word? It's an intellectually freeing move. And because I agree with you that Marx has amazing insight into capital, but his solutions are almost always completely impracticable outside of a European environment. And you know who else said this? Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, committed Marxist thinker and philosopher, said that Marx's refusal to take seriously religious and spiritual concerns, he said that made Marx's philosophy completely irrelevant for all African descended people. He said for Europeans who had never had an emancipatory spiritual movement emerge inside the church. They only had repression, emerge inside the church. It's natural to come with this kind of blanket, condemnation of religion as the opium of the masses. But for indigenous populations in Africa or in Asia or in South America, who have had spiritually nurturing traditions that functioned in healthy, symbiotic ways with non-hierarchical political authorities, the idea that you would just throw out your, the traditions that have nourished people spiritually and culturally over centuries and replace it with an atheist philosophy from Europe, that's just madness. And it's not going to happen, right? The only ideology, the only religious, ideology that has never gained any currency in the African continent is atheism, right? Christianity has done well there. Islam has done well there. You find pockets of Buddhism and other spiritual traditions. And the reason is that outside of Western societies, the vast majority of humanity has always believed in an unseen world, that there is a metaphysical space outside of this physical space. And that if you wanted to
Right.
have sound relationships inside this material physical realm, then you also needed to, to build proper spiritual relationships between human beings, as above, so below, that you're trying to actually, create harmony inside human societies, inside individual human beings. And to return back to where we started, if you are only drawing on Eurocentric traditions and Eurocentric narratives, rather than exploring what those indigenous traditions have to teach us about how to organize human societies, then from my perspective, you're still engaged in a colonialist endeavor. You haven't broken loose from the intellectual framework of imperialism. That's the theoretical point. The practical point is much shorter.
I 100% agree with you. And like I said, you are one of the first people that I personally heard talk about this. It needs more attention for the public. And I just want to preface this, and I want to be very clear with the audience. I appreciate Marxists, I appreciate socialists, I appreciate communists. They're all part of this revolutionary family. Absolutely. And I love it. Yeah. So I want to get that clear. However, it doesn't mean we can't have friendly disagreements. And my personal disagreement with Marxism is that it is very Eurocentric. It is intellectually supremacist. It's pretending that all cultures around the world, except in his particular world, they don't exist. When most of the planet, you got 2 billion Muslims on the planet. You have 2 billion Christians, I believe, on the planet, around there.
Yep,
so
north of that, but yep.
To pretend that the rest of the world doesn't exist, especially in places like Africa, where tradition and religious beliefs is, like you said, woven into the fabric of their society, that actually has it's a positive asset. So again, it's just a little critique of Marxism and socialism. And also one of my biggest critiques of it is that the steps, the goal of socialism and Marxism and communism is to get to an egalitarian society. Where I find a negative point and a con, and something that I find to be impractical, is that in order to get there, you have to go through a bottleneck of statism and hierarchy.
Every single time. And I mean, this is the real issue, is that if you look at the practical instantiations of communism that have come into being, they are actually essentially state-controlled capitalism.
Yep.
And that is something that I can't stomach, I can't conscience, and it actually goes to the practical point, which is that revolution is literally just means a turning of a wheel, right? It means that which was at the bottom comes to the top, and that which was at the top goes to the bottom. But you're still in the same circle, okay? And that is a fundamental issue, is that most of our revolutionary imaginings are just imagining those that are at the bottom on the top. It's not changing the nature and function of the system. And that's why I've said, and people sometimes misunderstand this or think that it's an apologetic for capitalism. It isn't. What I usually say is that that socialism, or rather, let me say this more technically accurate. Marxism, properly speaking, is just an inversion of the value system and the social group that controls a capitalist society. Pardon me for the detour into French philosophy, but Jean-Paul Sartre said that the antithesis must always contain the thesis within it, okay? And that means both, that's linguistically true. Thesis and antithesis are contain each other. But it's also philosophically true. In order to respond to what capitalism does, you have to think and speak in the language of capitalism, and you form a diametrically opposed response. It's what Marxists talk about as a dialectic, right? But the issue is that you have had the terms of your discourse dictated to you by the capitalist system.
Yes.
The strength in approaching this through indigenous histories, indigenous moral philosophies, and indigenous forms of social organization is that they evolved completely distinct from a capitalist system in the first place. So they are not responding to capitalism, and therefore, here's a way to put it. The antidote to a poison always has to have some of the poison in it, right? To manufacture the antidote. The problem is that we are oftentimes imbibing a poison. And for me, as both a historian and someone that tries to theorize the next steps of the revolution, starting with the building blocks of indigenous societies that were free from this poison is a simpler, much more straightforward path to liberation than trying to remove that which is negative from this circle that is comprised of capitalist and Marxist approaches. We're just going to keep spinning the circle. And what I want is a completely different.
Okay, so I had a monumental change in my idealisms when it comes to how society should run. And that was after I had a peyote ceremony with my late spiritual leader, Chief Black Fox of the Dakota Sioux tribe. What happens in peyote ceremonies, you get some very strong revelations and enlightenment phases that and through that process, I realized that the indigenous way of life, the way that indigenous groups used to structure their societies, was so alien to what we see coming out of Europe, and it was so magical. It was so healthy, and yet we know very little about them. We know very little about indigenous ways of life because it's put only in the context of Orientalism and that's exoticism, as opposed to actually taking it serious as an actual functional societal mechanism that we could be using today in modern times. It's not an ancient thing. It's not something that was a thing of the past.
This is the issue, right? Is that the colonizing society appropriates and makes a cultural artifact of what had been a living dynamic organism. So to return to the point that I made in my first book, this is perhaps self-congratulatory, but it was an academic first book that was very, very much for like the specialist readers. This first, and most people never read an academic book. There were 3 journals that devoted entire special editions just to discussing my book because it was thought of as so radical in the way that it shook up, the kind of conversation in the field. And as I mentioned before, there were people that didn't, like some people didn't appreciate that intervention. Many people did. So I was pressed at one point in time by an Islamic studies scholar that basically accused me of being too close to the material because I wrote from inside the epistemology of African Islam about African Islam. In other words, rather than making an artifact of the thing that I was studying, I was actually utilizing it in order to frame the analytics in the study. Mm-hmm. And I was accused, therefore, of being compromised by being too close to the material because you're Black and you're Muslim. So therefore, if you write about African Islam, then you're writing about your own identity category and you're too close. So I said this simply. I said, if a secular...
Real quick. The hypocrisy in that statement is, from what context are they, what lens are they viewing it from? They can view it from their culture, but when you're viewing it from African culture, no, that's very unconventional, and it's
exactly
too taboo. It's too taboo.
Well, so which is precisely what I said. I said, let me get this straight. If a secular humanist writes about secular humanism from inside the epistemological framework of secular humanism, are they condemned as being too close to the subject? Of course not. No. Rather, it is imagined that they are capable of making not only commentary on secular humanism, but contribution to universal knowledge. So this is all part of a colonial mindset. And to return to your original point, is that the real way that we valorize indigenous knowledge systems and indigenous social systems and political systems is not by monumentalizing them as things that emerge from the past, but by operationalizing them as things that are capable of a healing, restorable, and sustainable future for humanity.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is my political ideology, what he just said. That is exactly what I believe.
Because that's a whole bar. I've never said that as clearly as I just said it, right?
I'm going to go back and I'm going to section that off and I'm going to put it in quotes in my wall in my office here. I'm going to look at that shit because you God, this is why I love you, because you articulate these things in the best way I've ever seen, in a powerful way that most people aren't exposed to. They're not exposed to this concept that indigenous social structure, like you said, is not a relic of the past. It's not something that we study about in the history books or exoticize or go visit some museum and say like, oh, wow, that's really interesting that they did that. It is actually a potentially very functional system that would benefit our lives and make our lives so much better than what we have now. And it's this paranoia, but it's this, again, it's this, it is a form of Eurocentralism where it's like, well, and it's also a fear. It's like, because they think that because it was in the past, well, does that mean we get to lose all this technology and all these luxuries we have? No. In fact, it just means that it's going to be the technologies that will develop out of that will be in more tune with nature and actually be more succinct with our lives.
So this is a really crucial point, and people don't like it when I say this, but I say it nonetheless, because it's really, really important that people like come to terms with this basic reality. So I've been asked a number of times, like, how do we decolonize? You know, and the thing that I usually say to people is that you actually can't decolonize. There's no putting the toothpaste back in the tube after it has already been expelled. There is no going back to the way that things were before all of this happened. That is an artifact of that tradition-making thinking and juxtaposing it with modernity and romanticizing a past for you to go back to. All of that is kind of neo-traditional fetishism. But what you can do is that you can draw on those living threads of those indigenous traditions to help heal from and light a new way forward. And we have to have the intellectual courage and audacity to chart a new way forward, right? Because the reality is that let's take, simple things like, the technological advancements that are usually associated with capitalism, but in fact don't have anything to do with capitalism. They have to do, primarily with human ingenuity. If we utilized the technological capacities of humanity to meet people's basic needs rather than to maximize profit, then we would actually be in a world where the needs, the basic needs of every human being are easily met and easily fulfilled, right? But the problem is that the structure and the system that we have right now is that capitalism does not actually want solutions or resolution to any of the fundamental basic needs of humanity. Because what capitalism wants to do is to monetize temporary solutions to the basic needs of humanity in order to maximize profit. And that's why Du Bois said that a system of universal selfishness can never bring social good to all. It requires extraction. So just a very, very simple example. And I think that I actually probably heard this from Kwame Ture the first time that I heard it. He talked about, what if you had the technological advancements were being driven by meeting basic needs rather than by maximizing profits? I mean, just think about this. They are perfectly capable of building a cell phone that you can use for the next 20 years.
Yep.
They're perfectly capable of building that. When they need to build space shuttles and other satellites and things that have to be durable for long periods of time, that are going to be circulating around Mars and coming back with pictures, they make shit built to last, right?
Yep.
It is perfectly within their capacity to not have the electronics break down and to need a new battery every 2 years. But the reason why it's built that way is that that's what allows corporations to maximize their profits, is the planned obsolescence. Well, the planned obsolescence is the thing that has kids dying in Congolese cobalt and coltan mines. Because if you're going to sell a new one every 2 years, instead of just building one that will last for 20, then you have to constantly be going and digging for more. And studies have recently shown that the so-called green revolution that the capitalists promised us, and I was never there for Elon Musk. I knew before everybody else knew, because I know the history of South Africa and I know the stock that he comes from. But there literally is not enough lithium on the planet to replace fossil fuels.
But you know what there is? Plenty of that they're trying to suppress as much as possible. Graphene, baby, in hemp. See, that's why the hemp was suppressed so heavily, was because they've discovered you can create graphene, which is far more, it's the most conductive material on the planet so far that you can produce, and you can produce it from hemp in a very cheap way, which is why they're really struggling right now to keep that a cap on that, because it would replace lithium, it would replace cobalt, it would replace so many of these, but and also hemp production would be one of those poverty. It would be a huge antidote to poverty, because anybody could grow it and anybody could provide their own product.
And one of these, kind of autodidactic, black geniuses, Moses West, he built this machine that literally synthesizes drinking water from breathable air, right? That there are all of these, fixes that, if the orientation of the system was actually towards the things that indigenous systems tell us are most important, right? Providing for people's basic needs, preserving people's basic dignity, right? Preserving their basic humanity. Then if our orientation was actually towards producing things that did that, we would have more than enough. And that's the reason why this is, you have your conspiracy, theory, conspiracy theories that you're prone to. We all have ours. I'm not much one for conspiracy theories, but one thing that isn't a conspiracy theory to me is the madness of the population control discourse, right? That, emerged, that Gates is involved in, and, other folks, because the reality is that the earth has more than enough food, more than enough resources to sustain a population that is many-fold higher than it currently is on Earth. It just cannot be sustained with these kinds of levels of profit and extraction for the ruling class. And therefore, they would much rather sterilize and kill off significant portions of the population than make any compromises in favor of sustainability. And we haven't talked about this yet. We haven't talked about this yet as part of the conversation, but the urgency, a huge portion of the urgency in the revolution, is that we are approaching a tipping point with our natural environment, which is going to make human life itself all but unsustainable if we don't correct our current trajectory. And you wanted to have Islam as part of the conversation. And I made a post about this just the other day, is that one of the things, I converted to Islam when I was 15. One of the things that was really, really striking for me in the distinction between the Judeo-Christian, version of the creation story and the Islamic one, and they're very, very closely connected. Like the deep spiritual kinship between the Abrahamic faiths is obvious. And perhaps this is the influence of kind of later, like Roman imperial Christianity upon this. I don't know enough about Christianity to say that. But here's this fundamental difference, is that I was always taught in Christian churches that Adam, the human being, was given dominion over the earth. And the first thing that you learn in the Quran is that the human being, the archetypal human being, Adam, is not given dominion. He's given khilafah, which means stewardship.
Responsibility.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the difference between dominion and stewardship is that
Husbandry.
Yeah, exactly. Is that dominion is a kind of possession. That means you're allowed to dispose of it as you will because it belongs to you. Whereas stewardship means that you're supposed to take care of it until God brings it back, which means you're going to be questioned on how you took care of it. That means it's a responsibility.
Because it's a gift. It's a gift from Allah. So one thing that stood out to me in getting to know Palestinian Muslims when I was in Jerusalem was that they saw everything, and this also relates to Native Americans. I saw a lot of parallels between Palestinian Muslims and Native Americans. And I'm not trying to just limit this to Palestinian Muslims, but those were the Muslims that I was around the most.
Interact with, sure.
I was taught about Islam through Palestinians, so therefore my bias and my indoctrination that I received was from Palestinian Muslims. So, their attitude about nature and the world around them was that everything was a gift from Allah.
That's it.
And you respect that gift. And I remember talking with one of my friends over there, and he was telling me that you don't cut, and it's against Islam to cut down a tree.
Yes.
And I'm like, that's interesting. Why? It's like, well, because a tree is a gift from God. It brings life,
and sustains future generations. You're thought of as stealing from the future if you do it.
And that is identical to Native American philosophy on nature as well. There's the saying, we don't inherit. We're not inheriting the land from our ancestors. We're borrowing it from our children. And so that is the same philosophy that Palestinians who have olive groves, that they grow olive trees, is that that's for their future generations. So, and like he's tying this back to Islam, I want to get into this more. I want to do this in the form of an hypothesis as a student to you as a professor, and then you can critique it and this. So let me bring this up real quick. So I've had this hypothesis for a long time about Islam, that as of yet, you are the first person to make a video concurring somewhat of my hypothesis. I've seen your videos, and you're the first person that I've seen that's actually kind of concurred with what I'm saying. And that is, Western Empire has prioritized Islam as its number one enemy, and therefore the subsequent Islamophobic policies and rhetoric of Western leaders, most notably in our generation, starting with George Bush and onward in the global war on terror, quote unquote, which is simply a dog whistle for global war on Islam. Let's be honest. We see this characterization in liberal Hollywood, churches across the Bible Belt, political discourse, which I can personally attest to and fell victim to once upon a time. I used to be an Islamophobe myself before going to Palestine. And the reason why Islam is their number one target is simply because of the grassroots nature of conversion to Islam. It's the fastest growing religion on the planet. Right. That combined with the fact that Islam goes completely counter-political and counter-cultural to Western Empire and its tenets and doctrines. Compounding interests is the bedrock of predatory Western capitalism. It's completely vilified and forbidden in the Quran. So, and the respect of the environment. We just talked about the environment. Islam is an environmentally friendly religion. It like you said, it values the earth and the land and is against exploitation. And Islam is in and of itself a religion of revolution. If the government is not serving the people, and if it is evil and if it is corrupt, it is your duty as a Muslim to fight against it, simply because it is oppressing people. When you're a prophet, peace be upon him, I say that out of respect. In his time, when the very formation of the faith and the beginning stages of Islam was in and of itself a revolution against the elites who were oppressing people in Medina and Mecca, including women, including people of all of the religions, people of other religions, including Jews, the oppression of Jews, the oppression of Christians. So Islam is a religion of revolution, and it is opposed to all things that are toxic about capitalism. Therefore, the elites know this, so they have made it enemy number one through and framing it and using all of the like every accusation is confession. All the things that capitalism is guilty of doing, they accuse Islam of doing to get the population fearful of it. So that's my theory. And I proposed this to Dr. O'Mara, the historian, and I'm proposing it to you as an historian. If you could critique that and offer your insights.
Yeah, there is a deep abiding truth in the position that you take, and it's a historically conditioned reality. So what do I mean when I say that? This is not just theoretical. The first thing to say is that, and this is something that I write about in my first book. It's something I write about in my other academic works. The first groups to offer organized systemic resistance to the rise of the Atlantic slave trade. And the Atlantic slave trade is the confluence of capitalism and white supremacy. So that's the beginning of the modern imperialist world that we now reside in. African Muslims were at the forefront of that. They organized resistance to the Atlantic slave trade beginning in the 1500s in West Africa, rooted in Islamic moral, ethical, legal, and political principles. And Muslims were thought of as being so inherently opposed to these systems of oppression that by the 15 teens and 1520s, the Spanish were making legal pronouncements to stop importing African Muslims to New Spain, what's now Mexico, because they were too frequently associated with slave rebellions, maroon communities, people that fled from bondage and established their own independent societies away from the Spanish colonial sphere and away from later Brazilian plantations and so forth. So there's an immediate association as early as the 1500s of Islam with resistance to capitalism and white supremacy. It's not just the theoretical opposition that you've elucidated, but it's actually a practical resistance that emerges right from the beginning. And I write about how in the 1770s there's literally an anti-slavery movement that abolishes the slave trade, abolishes slavery in the Senegal River Valley, sends slave traders packing, and the founder of the London Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, a Christian preacher, learns about it and writes an entire book that becomes the foundation of the European abolitionist movement. So the resistance to slavery, oppression, white supremacy, and capitalism is hardwired into especially the African Muslim tradition. But the African Muslim tradition is able to draw it out because it is there in the foundational text. It is there in the sacred story itself. I often say this, and I literally just did an online spiritual intensive. We had about 150 people attend it on Islam and anti-imperialism because this is such a close connection. Just a really simple thought exercise, right? When you study the Quran, the principal prophet that is understood to be the kind of moral archetype for the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is the Prophet Abraham. Well, why do we know who Abraham was? Because Abraham is toe-to-toe with Nimrod, the most powerful, oppressive tyrant on the face of the earth in his time.
Yep.
We know the name Moses, Musa, peace be upon him, because he is toe-to-toe resisting the most powerful tyrant on the face of the earth in his time. Jesus, Isa in the Islamic tradition, John the Baptist, Yahya in the Islamic tradition. Why do we know them? Because they are being persecuted by the Roman Empire, the most brutal imperial state on the face of the earth in its time. And the way that the Quran tells the story of all of these prophets is that they are at the forefront of the struggle against the fundamental injustice that defines their age. And if you want to know who the people of God are, the people of God are the people that are on the front line struggling against the principal oppression of the age. And that is exactly what the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, did. He struggled against the emergence of exploitative merchant communities in Mecca. He struggled against religious oppression when he was established in Medina. And if you look at the early military campaigns, not the imperialism of the Umayyads or the Abbasids that comes later, that for me doesn't have anything to do with Islamic teaching. That's really Arab conquest, and it's a separate conversation. But if you look at there are two military campaigns that take place during the Prophet's own lifetime, and they are against the two most powerful, ruthless, exploitative imperial states on the face of the earth in that time. What's left over of Rome, Byzantium, and the Persian Empire in that same period. And those are the only two military campaigns, because the reality is that lifting the yoke of imperialist exploitation from humanity is the most pious of all possible acts. And the reason is that in the sacred tradition of Islam, there is nothing more valuable than a single individual human soul. And the most pious thing that you can do is keep oppression and harm from reaching this precious creation that is the human being. Now, the one thing that I will add to your framing is that unfortunately, the Gulf states specifically have been like ruthlessly co-opted into a capitalist system. And the version of Islam that they promote and promulgate is explicitly apolitical. It is one that is extractive, destructive of the environment. And, some Muslims got mad at me when I said that Saudi Arabia is Israel in a thobe, that you can never expect any, emancipatory work to come from them, because they actually, a lot of people don't understand that the Saudi political authorities were established in authority in the 1920s by the British. They are essentially the functional equivalent of Zionism in Palestine, and it's the reason why they are in no way coming to the defense of their Arab brothers and sisters in Palestine, because this is people that have bought in completely to the capitalist and imperialist system, and as you mentioned before, this is how the capitalist and imperialist system functions. It will often just buy off or assassinate rule. Like you look at Egypt, and the current president, Sisi, is essentially a lapdog for the West. We're now just learning through Washington Post reporting that that the president of Egypt seems to have prepared a $10 million cash payment to candidate Donald Trump to try to help reimburse him for out-of-pocket expenses. So these are people that are deeply corrupted, right? And the unfortunately, like the political tradition of most so-called Middle Eastern, countries is now very, very far from this inherently radical resistance tradition that is organically and naturally part of the Islamic legacy, and that you saw, in my West African ancestors as they struggled both in West Africa to abolish the slave trade there and against, plantation exploitation in the New World. You saw it in Malcolm, right? To return back to where we started. Another kind of articulate, brilliant, incisive critic of this exploitative imperialist system. He taught us how to read Zionism. He taught us how to read hypocrisy between the liberals and the conservatives.
Isn't it amazing how Malcolm, years on, is just his words are ringing true? I mean, there's something so comforting.
He saw flaw.
He did, and the way he said it was, there's like a comforting element to the way he talked. It was like he spoke with this, I don't know how to describe it, but when you hear the way he relayed it, it was comforting and it was universal. It was not alienating to other groups. It was kind of like, hey, we're all getting screwed. Here's who's screwing us. You're getting screwed. You're getting screwed, and I'm getting screwed. This isn't a universal thing. It
Yeah.
wasn't a blame game. It was very much a
when Malcolm, was free of the Nation of Islam's, restrictions on his tongue, when he was, in the last years of his life, able to speak independently. I mean, he don't get me wrong, he was a gifted orator and, an incisive social critic when he was part of the nation, but he was doing the intellectual work of Elijah Muhammad during that time. When he's free and independent and imagining, like the future himself, and he's, thinking about coalition building and international coalition building, and he's traveling, through Africa and traveling through the Middle East, what you are describing is a person who has absolute moral clarity and clarity of purpose about his own role in the unfolding drama of liberation. And if I were just to add one piece to this conversation, is that the spiritual disciplines of Islam is that's what they're actually designed to cultivate, is people who are self-aware, not just of our own, our collective place. What I often say to Muslim audiences is this. I said, listen, the Quran can tell you why we are here as people, but God is going to have to tell you individually why you are here as a person, what your role in this drama is. And for that, it takes the inner work. And Malcolm was somebody that had done the inner work. And you see it reflected with the moral clarity that he has about the collective struggle, and he understands what role he is meant to play in it. So he moves with no wasted motion, incisive. He is a
I know. He was on a mission. He was on a journey. I find it so inspiring, his personal journey when he went to Mecca for the Hajj.
Yeah.
When he was in community and in fellowship with people, white people, right? He had a lot of trauma from white people as a kid. You saw his, a lot. Now, and that's the thing about racial relations is that a lot of it's based in trauma. And you have a Mexican kid who might be bullied by an Asian kid in his younger years.
We're brutalized.
And you have trauma from that. Now, ironically, I have trauma from white people as a kid, and I wrote a book about it. Back in 2016, I wrote a book called Jesus is Black, Get Over It, written by a white guy. And it was basically...
I'm a DM you offline with my mailing address. I need a copy ASAP, but go ahead. Yeah.
All right. Well, it was written in 2016, so I'm sure there's some problematic stuff in there.
I don't care. I still need that book.
All right. Yeah. Like I do mythologize Black people in that. I do... there is a lot of Black supremacy in that book. And I see, as a kid, I had a traumatic experience on a playground at Fort Hood, Texas, when I was 5 years old, when my dad was stationed at the military base. We're staying at a hotel, and I was on the playground. Really large, redhead, white kid. We're on those rusty merry-go-rounds, those death cycles. I got caught underneath it, and this big white dude was just ramming it, and I thought I was gonna die.
Yeah,
I thought I was gonna die. The parents weren't doing anything, and out of nowhere, this skinny, young Black kid grabbed me and ripped me out from under that with such strength. And basically, in my opinion, he saved my life. But that was a traumatic experience for me. And you think about the impression it had on me at that age: big white kid, Black kid saving my life. And I realized that a lot of that trauma played into a lot of bias I had growing up. I didn't get along with white kids growing up. I always hung out with like the brown and Black kids. I didn't really feel accepted amongst white people, and that led all the way up into my even my 30s. And in fact, it was only a few years ago that I had my first positive experience with just white people for the first time in Phoenix, Arizona. So I say that, I'm saying all this because all of us have traumas that often are racial related, whether we're treated as a kid. And obviously Malcolm X had all those traumas, which is very understandable. And his journey in going to Mecca, where he was surrounded by white Muslims, he even wrote about it, how it changed his perspective on the universality of life.
So this is such an incredibly important point, and I'm just realizing as I look at the time that this may be the last one that I can enter into in detail. This is also to return to where we started, about how we have a revolution that's successful, not just in replacing who's on the bottom and who's on the top, but actually in forging a new era of liberation, is that very, very, very simple. And I said this, man, I was doing an event in DC, probably we had maybe 400 Muslims in the house at this mosque in the DC area. And this was October 9th, right? So this is like right after missiles start flying. And I said, listen, I didn't specify whether I was talking about my people as Black people or as Muslims, but I actually meant as Black people first and then as Muslims second. And what I said was, the thing that I fear most for my people is that we would be given the power over our enemies that our enemies have had over us before God heals us from the trauma that our enemies have inflicted upon us.
Yes.
Because hurt people hurt people. And if you don't believe me, ask a Zionist. If you don't believe me, ask a Zionist about how the trauma that was inflicted upon Jews has now been weaponized in order to justify the victimization and brutalization of others. And if you study cycles in history, you see this happen over and over again, right? Great book in the African historical writing tradition called "When Victims Become Killers," about the if I'm not mistaken, the Rwandan genocide. So this is the issue: is that we absolutely need these indigenous traditions of spiritual healing and restoration.
Yes,
because unless we are made whole after what empire has done to us, we are bound to reproduce the crimes of the imperium in whatever social systems we are going to make going forward. And this is why the community building work, the work of inner spirituality, the work of love and solidarity, that is the whole of the struggle. Because if we go through 20 years of tumultuous combat, and just to become our oppressors version 2.0, then it was all for nothing.
Yes.
It was all for nothing. And that more than anything is why I absolutely insist on not just commemorating, but on actually participating in the practice of the revival of these traditions. It's the reason why I do spiritual intensives. I'm doing one at the Lighthouse Mosque in Oakland, this weekend on the African Islamic, spiritual and resistance legacy. I'm doing one in Philadelphia 2 weeks, after that, because it's not just about, political critique and about strategy. It is actually about renewing the battered souls of human beings who have been crushed in various ways. And you talked about one of them quite literally, crushed in various ways by a society that produces racialized predation and all kinds of sociopaths, frankly, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
The last thing I'll say about this, Malcolm had his experience in this when he went on Hajj, when he traveled through, West Africa and through East Africa as well. Also visited Palestine, as has been well documented. For me, it was when I went to Senegal. When I lived in Senegal doing PhD research, I learned the Wolof language, speak the Wolof language fluently. I knew it had entered my head when I would wake up talking in my sleep in Wolof. And it was so liberating to be free from the intellectual and practical frameworks of white supremacy. Only then could I start to really grapple with why I was here, right? What I was meant to do individually, because these systems of capitalist extraction are meant to turn you into a commodity. These systems of racialization are made to turn you into an enemy to your fellow man. These systems of misogyny and patriarchy are designed, to weaponize your sexuality rather than using it as the basis for human procreation and reproduction. All of these things are distortions of our sound, basic, fundamental human nature. And until we are restored back to that integrality, we are going to be enemies to ourselves and to our fellow human beings, even when we are trying to be agents of their emancipation. And so the inner work and the outer work are deeply and intimately connected. And that is the one thing, that I see as, sort of most lacking from the contemporary revolutionary activist space, is that people aren't connecting that inner work with the outer struggle in the organic way that it must be connected.
I agree. I love that. I love the way you put that. We have to heal, because once we stop the racial divide, the reason why, and I saw this meme, it was perfect. It was saying the reason why people are afraid of dropping their racism and their hatred is because it will force them now to deal with the pain,
James
the
Baldwin.
internal pain.
James Baldwin.
Yep. That's right. No. You posted that. What am I doing?
No, I reposted it, but it was James.
You reposted
Baldwin.
it. Yeah,
James Baldwin that
it was beautiful.
It was James.
Beautifully put. Beautifully put. And we see this whole process through Malcolm X's life.
Yes.
Like by studying Malcolm X's personal development, we are also bringing ourselves through the process of revolution, of a successful revolution.
Yes.
It's just we just have to continue his work.
Inner revolution is the predicate of outer revolution. That's
exactly.
It. That's it. So
exactly.
We're gonna have to deal with Killer Kamala in the next in the next issue of the podcast.
I know.
Podcast. But I will say just one thing, as I get ready to log off, is that I was so disappointed, man, to see so many abolitionists, suddenly, just start lining up for, genocide, the carceral state, and closed border policies, just because they put a Black woman in charge. I mean,
bro, it's so annoying. This tokenization, this. Like you put it best in one of your videos. I mean, it's, but I mean, are people really buying this, or is it manufactured online to give the impression?
I think
bots and forums.
I think a lot of it is manufactured. I was actually working on a post. I haven't been able to vet the contributors yet to see if they're, kind of right-wing plants, because I don't like amplifying right-wing plants. But there's a series of Black women commenting on Kamala Harris's rally in Georgia. And, the overarching point was basically like, damn, this is what they think of us. Like, you don't have to give us any policy. You just think that if we have some booty shaking, you're going to get our votes. That's the main point. But the point to the bot farm was that one of them was basically saying, listen, this is how they do things in Fulton County. When they know that the stadium isn't going to be filled, they bring in, the homeless community to fill up the stadium. They're like, nobody was at that rally in Georgia. Now, I don't know the truth of that. And that's why I haven't yet amplified that. But it would not be at all out of character, right? We heard Brianna Joy Gray talking about, like, the K-Hive on social media largely behaves like the bot army of Hillary Clinton, that it wasn't real grassroots support. It was just an online, bot army. And Chris Hedges has talked about this, right? He's talked about the fact that as reprehensible as the Trump base is, it is a real base. Whereas the Democrats do not have a real organic social base for their candidate. And they've done a lot to make sure that they don't have one, because they have made sure that every single time the partisans of the Democratic Party, or people that are left-leaning more generally, have tried to get engaged in the process and to assert their choice, the party elites, the corporate neoliberal establishment has shot that down, right? So you had, Bernie, and Bernie's a progressive, not a radical. But that was a lot more than the party elites were ever willing to accept. And so they absolutely torpedoed his candidacy and made it impossible. And now we had an opportunity to have, like, an open process for the Democratic nomination. And in typical, fashion, these liberal, foxes that smile, and you think that they're smiling at you, but they're really just baring their teeth because they're about to eat you, as Malcolm put it. All they were doing
he was so good with those,
good,
analogies.
dude.
I can listen to them over and over again.
I mean, because they're so brilliant in their clarity. So what they did was they essentially pushed things back far enough that there could be actual no voter input, and they could have just a coronation of their selected choice to run. Because if they had forced out Biden earlier, then we would have actually had an open Democratic, national convention. We would have actually had a primary process where Joe Biden would have had to get up on stage, and debate people, and people would have been like, "Oh, damn, that dude is the crypt keeper," right? From if you remember that show, Tales from the Hood, that dude is the crypt keeper. Like, he's not a functioning person. He is an ossified mummy that they are propping up. No, seriously, right?
That's so true, yeah.
And we would have been able to have a conversation on what progressive, and I believe that even as a radical, there are things that they could have done that would have secured my participation on their side. They really could have. If they had been running an anti-war candidate, then I'm here to listen. I haven't talked about this, publicly, but conversations now to do an online interview with Dr. Jill Stein, hopefully later next week, because I think that a lot of us that are actual progressives and radicals want representation that is actually openly anti-genocide and openly anti-war. So they could have had us, but they didn't want us. Because they want control of the system. The last thing that they want is people like you and me having input into the process. And that's why we need to take the revolution into our own hands. Last thing, and I really actually do have to go now. The last thing that I'm going to say on this is that somebody made a really, really smart post about how revolution is not as far away as you think it is, right? Mm-hmm. That so much organizing work had been done that when the Russian Revolution happened, they just were able to sort of elbow the monarchy, aside. True. It can happen through existing institutions. It can happen through, civic organizations. It can happen through even political parties.
Yeah.
The problem, the thing that I think that analysis is missing, and the thing that I fear, is that I actually think that most of the political party revolutionary organizing work about how you stage a takeover of the government in a bloodless way has already been done by fascists inside the Republican Party. I think that they have actually been staging a revolution this whole time, and that the Supreme Court now looking the way that it does and acting the way that it does is part of that revolution. When Trump says, "Come on, Christians, come out and vote. This is the last time you're going to have to vote."
Yeah, they know. It's because, and it goes back to my theory of judo, social judo. Whenever the government, the elites know that society is going one way, or they're itching for a revolution, or they're fed up, or they're very disgruntled, what you do is you take that momentum, just like you do in judo, you shift the weight and you shift it towards the direction you want it to go so you can control it, as opposed to just letting it happen. So you could fight the revolution, which they're going to lose. They know that. So rather they would be like, all right, let's have a revolution. And let's shift that weight towards the direction we want it to. At the end of the day, we still control them. We still have them divided, and we can still exploit them. It's just that they think that they're in a revolution. And that's
they think they're in a revolution, and their revolution is blame the blacks, blame the Muslims, blame the gays. Don't
blame the immigrants coming from the border because they're all taking your jobs.
Definitely don't blame, the elite.
The people who are fucking us.
That have doubled their wealth. Billionaires have doubled their wealth in the last 4 years. No, it's definitely not them. It's definitely that the Mexican migrant laborer who is working for $2.75 an hour. He is
that are crammed with 9 people inside one apartment and not blaming, let's say, the outside, like the immigrants that are coming here legally on behalf of some other empire. or a corporation to buy American farmland and buy American real estate through a shell corporation, and then siphoning that money and profits back overseas, like Israelis do.
That's what white supremacy has always done, though, right?
Yeah.
It's like, here, hate that guy. It's like, oh yeah, we should hate him. And while you're looking over there, they got their hands in your pockets, pulling everything you got right out of your pockets, and you over here pointing to some Mexican dude or some black dude. Love you, brother. I gotta bounce. Thank you for
you too as well. And Butch, before you go, I just want to say, we are eternally fortunate to have you as a voice in this movement, in the Palestinian movement. You are a concise speaker for revolution. Your knowledge of history and the dynamics that led to successful revolutions that were cut off, I want to bring it back. And I do believe that, you know, you're the one to help us do that in many ways. So I hope we can have you back on with other guests to talk to discuss all the other elements of revolution that we didn't even touch upon. We covered like 5%, but it was great what we did cover. I'm glad the roads we went down. So, brother, we're grateful to have you. And I speak from that from the bottom of my heart. And I speak for a lot of other people. So that being said, family, thank you for tuning in. I hope you watched the whole thing. Give him a follow. Follow his lectures and his speaking, follow his tour dates and all that, and show him your support. That being said, bye guys. Keep up the revolutionary spirit, and free Palestine.
Free Palestine from the river to the sea.
Yes, sir.